Welcome. I'm Ron Baker, Director of the Canadian Small Church Ministry Center, sponsored by Small Church Connections. Today, we also have the opportunity of being here at Eston College, where a number of students are with us. You won't be able to see them particularly, but they're in the background. We look forward to having guests with us, two guests whom we've had before. They started talking about the survey, Canadian Evangelical Small Church Survey. I think it was a year and a half, 2 years ago, guys, that you were on and just started discussing a little bit about a survey that's now completed. The report is out, and we're going to talk a little bit about that report.
My name is Rick Heimstra. I am the director of the Center for Research on Church and Faith. That's a ministry of the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada. And I've worked in a research role since 2007. And before that, I was a small church pastor, pastored a small Wesleyan church of about 70 people in Cornwall, Ontario. So, this research is very real and personal for me. I live in Ottawa, Ontario, have a family, married with 4 children. The oldest is 22 and the youngest is 15.
All right. And then let's pop over to Lindsay. Take it away.
Thanks, Ron. So I'm Lindsay Callaway. I'm a researcher with the Center for Research on Church and Faith with the EFC. I've been with the EFC for about 3.5 years now. And I also live in Ottawa. And, Ron, you had mentioned it's been about a year and a half since we were last on. I've moved homes and I've had a baby since the last time that we spoke. So
okay,
that's me filling you in. But I do still live in Ottawa. I have 3 children, and my husband is a pastor at a larger church here in the city, but I grew up in a small rural church just out about an hour away from Ottawa.
Okay, so with some of that in mind, we're in the perfect position here. Small church pastoring and small church connections along the way for both of you. Why don't we start off with a few questions that came out of the report that you've just finished, the survey you've just finished. Lindsay, you want to start us off. What's a congregational covenant, and why is that important for small churches?
I'm so glad that we're starting here because I think this is one of the most helpful concepts that came out of our data. So a congregational covenant is what we've called the unwritten understandings of what a church and its mission are all about. And oftentimes there's these symbolic or emotional ties to the covenant. So it can be the church building or the church name. Sometimes it's objects. I remember actually my mom told me this story about this time they were hosting a baby shower for the pastor's wife in my small home church. And she and some other women had used the wrong linens for the event.
No.
And they got quite a scolding from a more seasoned member. Now, I do think that there was a lock picked in the process, so maybe the scolding was justified, but
okay.
But using the wrong linens for the wrong event is an indication that there's an understanding about how the church ought to function and why. And there are usually these gatekeepers who serve to protect this understanding, this covenant. But what we found is it's more than nostalgia. Covenants are usually formed at the founding or golden age of the church, and they reflect the founding philosophy for why the church exists. And it's not just we exist to preach the gospel and live as the body of Christ, but we're doing those things in this place, in this time, in these ways. And in the case of my church growing up, it was a Baptist community for German immigrants. And the covenant functions as sort of this origin story for that community. And then faithfulness to that covenant can often become a litmus test for faithfulness to the gospel. So because in most cases, sorry, go ahead.
I'm just going to interrupt you here, but so 100-year-old church, someone coming in as a new pastor, say a young pastor, how on earth do they get to understand that congregational covenant? Because 100 years ago, it was made up and it's been sort of carried by somebody. What are your thoughts on that? And Rick, if you want to jump in as well, but we'll let Lindsay run with it for 2 minutes and then we'll flip it over.
Sure. Well, so I'm glad you brought this up, because this idea of the covenant is closely related to a resistance to change. And that's because, say, the pastor comes in and wants to change the name of the church or the location or add a service. The pastor is calling into question the founding vision, the marks of faithfulness. And the congregation often resists because there isn't enough trust built into that relationship. And the pastor has to give the covenant due respect, due honor, and understanding. Otherwise, the congregation will tend to just resist, even when they can't quite articulate why. It usually comes out as, you're being divisive, or this is just the way that we've always done it. So I actually asked a pastor in an interview, how do you bring about change? And he said, 1 cup of coffee at a time. It's the slow process of building trust.
Yeah. Okay, Rick, what would you say about the whole congregational covenant?
Yeah, I would say that the way that you learn about the covenant is you visit people and you listen to their stories and you try to figure out from watching what gets resistance, where you're violating the covenant. But it takes a long time to understand people. But I think that this is an important thing, that people want to know that you love the church for what it is before you try to change it into something else. They want to know that you're one of them before you have permission to propose changes. And I think that this is how small churches are different than larger churches, is that a lot of the decision making is more by consensus. Rather than you have a leadership team, right? So when you're a young pastor and you come into a church and you're new there, you're not part of the leadership team until they grant you that authority. And this is where I think a lot of new pastors, they get into trouble, because they go in and they've been taught sort of large church values and approaches, and I'm coming in as the leader and I'm going to lead you now. Whereas you may not be a leader in any real sense until you've built those relationships, till you have that relational capital, and you need to get to a place where they feel that you love them for what they are.
Yeah. Now I know. Yeah, I know within the survey you didn't ask the question directly, but if I were to ask you the question and sort of rummage around in your heads, Lindsay and Rick, when did that happen for most pastors? When does that happen for most pastors, that they feel like they've got that, I'm ready to go ahead?
Well, this is kind of received wisdom. It's not pulling from stats or anything, but most people say that it takes about 7 years before a congregation starts to trust you. And interestingly, that is about the time that most pastors move on.
That's exactly what I was going to say.
And so they quit just a little bit too soon before they get into the really fruitful part of their ministry.
Lindsay, anything you want to comment on that?
I have nothing really to add. I know that other research confirms this. I think there was a study that Tom Rainer did in the States, and it was a very similar number that he found.
Yeah. Okay, let's jump to a new question, because I know this podcast can go on for hours and hours. Yeah, anyways, second question. Is there a way to distinguish what I would call the emphases that retiring pastors have as they look at their small church? Half of the survey, I guess, was retiring pastors, and a lot of small churches are run by retiring pastors. Is there a way to distinguish their emphases versus here's a young fella just coming into the church, or a young lady, and they're walking in and they're something they want to see done? Is there a difference that you noticed? I don't think I saw a correlation or any graphs on that, but is there anything that you sort of sensed in that?
Well, the first thing I say is that in our sample, about half were about 12 years away from retirement. And so we're talking about 65 as a retirement age. Now, in reality, there are a lot of pastors over the age of 65 that are still pastoring.
Yes,
so but what it does signal to denominational leaders and others is that we need a lot more pastors coming in behind them to take those positions. And, this isn't something that our study looked at, but I know from other stats that I'm not sure that our Bible colleges and seminaries are graduating enough pastors, training enough pastors to fill those positions. And so that is going to have consequences for churches that aren't able to find pastoral leadership. And we're going to expect a lot of those vacancies in the next 10 years, 10, 12 years. We didn't look specifically at this, but we are currently creating some tools that will allow us to cut the data in those ways and take a look. So one of the things that we promised to the denominational leaders that helped us is that we were going to provide them custom survey results that sort of match and mirror what you see in the report. And we're just about done that, and we'll be delivering that soon. So in the same way that we could isolate the results for a denomination, we could split the data by older and younger pastors and take a look at it. Now, that's a long-winded way of saying we haven't done that yet.
Okay.
But that doesn't mean that we don't have some observations about differences. And one of the differences between older and younger pastors that was really clear is that older pastors tend to stay in their pastorate longer than younger pastors. It's usually a few years, but this is really significant because if we're looking at, say, that 7-year threshold as the place, as the hump over which you have to get in order to get into fruitful ministry, there would be a sense of potentially an idea that younger pastors weren't seeing the fruit, when this may not be a function of their age so much as a function of, did I stay long enough to get to those years? And so there'll certainly be generational differences as well. Something that our study didn't look at specifically, but Sam Reimer and Michael Wilkinson in their book, A Culture of Faith, one of the things that they noticed generationally with pastors is that younger pastors have less of a tolerance for dealing with internal church politics. So when the going gets rough, they will either leave their church or leave the ministry, whereas younger pastors are more likely to ride that out. And some of this are things that have to do with the training. So in our research, we did ask about what pastors felt that they were well prepared for. And one of the things that they felt that they were least well prepared for was dealing with boards and internal church politics.
You're coming to the question that's coming out of this. Okay, so what would an academic track in small church ministry look like for the students that are sitting here and those that have zoomed in with us as well? Lindsay, you got any marvelous ideas? I see you shaking your head.
No, it's a good question. And I think part of that question, though, is asking, what can we reasonably expect from seminaries and theological institutions? Do we expect them to teach us how to do building maintenance? Or
good idea, though. Good, yeah.
Right. How to handle, maybe some HR policies and insurance. So there is a tension because small church pastors tend to function more as generalists. They don't often get to just specialize in the realm of preaching and teaching and counseling. And so maybe we need to just think about the way that we're training pastors. Yes, giving them the biblical and theological foundation that so many of them said that they did receive, but then coupling that with whether it's an apprenticeship model approach where they go and pastor alongside a seasoned pastor who can show them the ropes, show them how to navigate some of the more bureaucratic and political relationships that are bound to happen in a small church. And possibly it's not just continuing education, but offering supports and resources that come to the pastor on their ground, on their terms, so that you're not taking the pastor out of their church, and training them in isolation of the context in which they're actually serving. So those are some ideas. I think Rick has some other ideas too.
Well, one of the very practical things about theological education is that it's expensive. And so we kind of have different models, right? What we typically do is we bunch up all of those expenses into 3 or 4 years right at the very beginning of their career when they don't have a lot of money, right? And then they graduate with a lot of debt, and then they go off often into small churches in places where they tell us that they weren't prepared well for a lot of the very practical things, right? So what we heard is that our Bible colleges and seminaries are doing well at preparing people theologically, preparing them to preach, but not so well at administration, building maintenance, leading boards, dealing with church politics. And, I always say, you can preach a bad sermon, that's not going to get you fired. But if you're bad at church politics, that's what's going to get you fired.
Yep.
And so, we bunch up all of our theological education at the beginning. But what if we, Lindsay mentioned an apprenticeship model, and I like that. And I think that this is more than lifelong learning, the way that we talk about sometimes, where, we just provide courses for pastors to do on an ongoing basis. An apprenticeship model is more intentional and involves a mentor, to use from the trades, a journeyman to come alongside you. This would be a senior pastor. And if you stretch that out a little bit, then you have a chance, and you're actually working in a local church context, then you would be able to see how a senior pastor deals with those political questions. You can talk through, you can process it, because a lot of learning is a function of talking through and trying to internalize the meaning of what you're experiencing. And I wonder if there is a way to stretch that out. It could be that you do a year of solid of schooling to sort of give you a theological grounding, and then maybe what would have been your last 3 years, that we stretch that out to 6, so that by the time you graduate, you've actually had 6 or 7 years of experience. And I think that a small church would rather have someone who got their theological training over 6 or 7 years than someone who got it over 3 or 4 without any of that experience and that integration of their learning. Now, the other advantage to that is if the apprenticeship comes with some salary, then you may get through that time without a huge amount of debt.
Okay, there's how we do school. Free of charge, sort of.
Well, at least it's a pay-as-you-go model, right?
Okay.
Rather than borrow and pay up front. So there are other models. There are, for some people, the traditional do it all up front is going to be the best model. Yeah. But I think that what we're learning is that there are sort of intangible things that the school might not be the best one to deliver, but you need that kind of mentoring relationship. And a lot of schools do what they call field education, which is still sort of tucked into the course model, where you have sort of a certain number of credits in a few semesters of field education, but it's just not long enough. And I'm making a judgment here, so forgive me if your program is excellent. It's just not long enough to experience the kinds of things, even through the life, sort of an annual life cycle of a church, and how things come up. What is it like to be at church when you're negotiating the budget for next year? What is it like to be at church at Christmas and Easter? What is it like when you're trying to recruit Sunday school volunteers? All of those kinds of things. That's what you don't get. Another thing that I think we have to talk about is what's our relationship with denominations and ongoing education. Many Bible colleges and seminaries are denominationally affiliated, and so they are organs of the denomination. But is there a role for denominational leaders to provide access, say, to a tradesperson to come in and talk about how do you negotiate for a new roof? What are the things you consider? When your furnace breaks down, who do you call? What's reasonable? What should you be considering? What government programs are there available for you to get some help because you're upgrading the efficiency of your furnace? What should you consider when there are windows to be replaced at the church? How do you finance that? What's the best way to go about financing it? Is it through your denomination? Is it through a bank? Like, these are questions that pastors deal with all the time. Or maybe you bring in a lawyer, and a lawyer talks about sort of religious and constitutional freedom issues around building rental, around HR. What people don't realize is that pastoral work is so complex, and it's more complex than it used to be. And this is why, you know, one of the things that we talked about in the report is that pastors need access to a network of their peers, because their peers are figuring this out, and denominations really can't codify fast enough the solutions to all these problems in a way to put out a nice published resource with a nice cover and deliver this to the pastors in a way that's going to be helpful. Really, if you're doing the roof, I want to do is I want to talk to the two pastors in my district who put a roof on last year. And I want to find out from them what I need to consider and think about.
Okay. I'm going to jump to a whole other question, and it's way off the beaten track here, but I found it interesting in the report itself that you talked about asking what topics preachers will preach on, and you gave them a list, very interesting list, over this next year or so. And if I can be very blunt, the surveys showed that basically not none of the pastors, but a good portion of the pastors really didn't want to talk about social issues, justice issues or whatever, as a topic for a sermon. Why?
Well, we had some feedback. So we've done a few retreats with Small Church Connections with small church pastors, and we gave them sort of a sneak peek at some of these results. And some of the feedback we got there was that that they saw this as a sermon topic. And, you know, sometimes our approach to Scripture is that we want to allow Scripture to sort of dictate our direction, and not have a topic dictate a direction. And so that's a hermeneutical commitment, and that could be some of it. Although, you know, we could make an argument that that Scripture does address all of life, and it could get there. I think some of it could be the sense that of feeling unprepared in some cases to deal with these topics. And I think that in many cases, there's our social media like culture that is ready to sort of jump on any position. And there may be a sense that there is just no winning with this. And so let's let sleeping dogs lie and not stir things up. You know, this would be a great follow-up for some of your students to do a thesis on, and to interview pastors and just talk with them about how they pick their sermon topics, and if they don't preach on some of these social issues, to talk with them about why. I think that that's kind of a follow-on research from this research that would be really interesting. Because if it is a matter of equipping, there are resources. EFC produces resources on these social issues, and there are others that do that. But the fact of the matter is that we all live in society and we're dealing with these social issues. And so, and the gospel has something to say to these issues. So we need to help each other to be able to teach and preach and make Christ look winsome and wonderful in an orthodox way.
Mhm. Lindsay, you got anything you'd like to throw in on that?
Just anecdotally, I think I can recall some conversations with pastors who felt like some of these social issues weren't relevant to their congregation. Those are the city issues.
Mm-hmm.
So I think some of the way that pastors address what they talk about in their pastors or in their sermons, is contextually, is just good. Context is going to play a role into what they think their congregation needs. I spoke with one pastor who said, we're still talking about whether jeans are appropriate in church. I haven't even been able to wrap my head around how I would address some of the issues that are going on, politically. So context does play a role as well. But I think that hermeneutical approach was really the driving force behind the strange responses that we got.
Mm-hmm. Okay, as usual, unfortunately, the podcast we're pretty well done as far as the podcast goes. So let me just run to one final question for both of you. If there was one piece out of this survey that you would want to, well, let's say talk to our students who are just about to go into ministry, or someone going newly into a small church, what would that one piece be? Lindsay, I'll let you start with that.
The thing that always sticks out to me, and maybe it's a small portion of the report, but it's how often pastors just made themselves available all the time and didn't always prioritize rest. And so I think I would say draw clear boundaries and mark off times for rest, turn off your phone, turn off your email, and really make sure that you are being restored and renewed, because you can't do it all. So prioritize your well-being and your rest.
Yeah. I think our students here have maybe heard that once or twice before, that you need to rest. Okay, Rick.
To follow on with that, Jesus sent out his disciples 2 by 2. We send our small church pastors out 1 by 1. Some of that is a financial reality. But we spend a fair bit of time in our report talking about the value of networks. And you're going to need networks of your peers, and there are different ways that you can find them. Because a reality is that pastoring generally, and small church pastoring in particularly, can be a very lonely business. And there are many confidential burdens to bear. One of the things that we point out is a need to be able to create networks where pastors can share those confidential burdens with the consent of their congregations. And what we're talking about here is maybe a new model, and denominations may have to help in the facilitation of building those models for those networks. But when I was a small church pastor, my congregation understood that if I had something I was working through, I might call my district superintendent and talk with him about that. And they were okay with that because he's the district superintendent. But if you have 50, 100 pastors all trying to connect with the district superintendent, there just isn't enough of them, right? And so what this means is that kind of advice is just not available because there isn't enough. And this is where a network sort of spreads out those valencies, those connections. And we have to create a situation where pastors have, maybe it's just a few pastors, but a few pastors that are kind of in a mentor or peer-like position where they can hear what's going on and give you some good advice, or maybe just pray with you. Because large churches have that built in, right? Everybody on staff, there's almost an assumption in many congregations that there is a cone of confidentiality within the pastoral staff. Small churches don't have that. And this is really, really hard on pastors. Some pastors will share their burdens with their spouses, but that's a gray area. Some congregations will recognize that and be okay with that. Others won't be okay with that. But our point is that we need to carry each other's burdens, and you have to recognize that you need others along with you for the journey. And we need to be talking with our denominations or other organizations about how we create those networks so that we don't carry those burdens alone. And I think we'll see greater longevity and less burnout among small church pastors if we can do that.
Okay, that is great advice. And I mean, I live within a place where the ministerial itself, and it's understood that the ministerial in our town will have that type of connection with each other. If we didn't, I'll tell you right now, there's one young pastor in our town that would be out of town already. And it was necessary to have that network. Anyways, this has been great. Thank you very much for joining us. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Ron.
Thank you for having us.